Okay. Well, good afternoon. It's another gorgeous afternoon in the Ozarks here, although we had a weird weather yesterday. It snowed for like 5 hours and none of it stuck. Weirdest thing I've ever seen. But anyway, we're going to go ahead and continue our discussion of Texas today and the study of the American West. Last week we talked about the Alamo, and we talked about how the Alamo was that iconic event in American history where 189 Texans martyred themselves for the cause of Texas independence. And today we're going to see what happened as a result of that. So let's go ahead and let's begin our discussion of the battle for Texas statehood, because that's basically what we're going to talk about today. I always start my presentations with a painting, and I love this painting. This is a painting of the bluebonnets of Texas. I've never seen the bluebonnets of Texas in bloom, but I've talked to people who have, and they say it's just absolutely gorgeous, that it's just for miles and miles you can see the bluebonnets in bloom. But I think that's a very beautiful painting. So, what happened after the Alamo? Well, the Alamo occurred toward the middle of March, first part of March, 1836. And at the same time the Alamo took place, there was a discussion going on amongst the Texan leaders about whether or not they should ask for equal treatment as Mexicans or whether or not they should declare their independence. And there's arguments on both sides. But on the very same day the Alamo fell, delegates met at a little place called Washington on the Brazos, and they answered that question when they finally decided they were going to declare their independence rather than trying to seek equal treatment for the Mexicans as citizens, much as had the Americans done, some 70 years or so before this, at Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. So the Texans decided to declare their independence. They were unaware at the time of what had happened at the Alamo. Word had not reached them yet that the Alamo had fallen and all 189 defenders had been martyred. So that was not part of the bargain as such. Sam Houston now had become the undisputed leader of Texas. Austin wasn't even in Texas at this time. Austin had traveled to the United States. He was trying to seek support for the Texan cause from the United States government. He was in Washington, D.C., pleading the Texans' case, stating that they needed the American help in order to succeed. So Houston is kind of now the undisputed leader of Texas. He was also given command of the military army, and it was his state, country, whatever you want to call it, at this point in time to defend. This is a copy of the original Declaration of Independence of the people of Texas. They have their own Declaration of Independence, much as we had ours, and it reads somewhat similar. There's a lot of similarities between the two declarations of independence. Now, about 3 weeks after the Alamo, Houston had begun his strategic retreat north in an attempt to pull Santa Anna's army deep into Texas and separate him from his supply lines. Santa Anna had traveled up the El Camino Real and had come to a little place called Goliath. Goliath, much as the Alamo, stood in his way, and it was defended by 400 Texans under the leadership of a man by the name of James Fannin. Fannin's a very famous name in Texas. And Fannin's defenders of Goliath, rather than martyr themselves, as had the Texans in the Alamo, decided they would surrender to Santa Anna. So they surrendered to Santa Anna, thinking they would be treated as prisoners of war. Santa Anna, by this time, had no use for Texas. and had no use for anybody associated with Texas. And he had made it very clear that anybody that stood in his way would be executed, would be destroyed. So what did he do? He had all 400 defenders executed. It was a total shock. No one expected this. Even some of Santa Anna's lieutenants complained. They said, you shouldn't do this. These people surrendered under the white flag. They're prisoners of wars. And Santa Anna said, I don't care. I'm executing them anyway. And he had all 400 executed, even though they had, not gone to war against him as such. Today we celebrate the Alamo, and everybody says, the Texans would shout, remember the Alamo, and they most certainly did. I don't want to, denigrate the Alamo in any way whatsoever. But from my reading, it was actually Goliath that kind of galvanized the Texans in their desire at that point to gain total independence. They knew there was no going back. They knew that Santa Anna wasn't going to let them surrender and compromise and regain any of their rights that they thought they had under Santa Anna. They knew that there was only one way out of this deal, and that was to fight. And if it meant fight to the death, then they were going to do it. So actually, Goliath probably had as much, if not more, to do with the galvanization of the Texans' independence movement than did the Alamo. April 21st, about 5-6 weeks after the Alamo, Houston has retreated all the way back to the coastline up around what we now know is Houston, Texas. It didn't exist then. Along a little river called the San Jacinto River near Galveston, Texas. And he had decided that this is where he was going to get Santa Anna into his trap. Remember, he's trying to pull Santa Anna as far away from his supply lines as he can, so he can't reinforce his troops, so he can't supply his troops like he wants to. So he has pulled Santa Anna all the way into the north part of Texas. By the way, this is a painting of Colonel James Fannin, the man who surrendered at the Goliath. By the way, there's to show you the brutality of Santa Anna. Fannin was forced to watch the execution of all his soldiers. He was the last one to be executed. And when they executed Fannin, they tied him into a chair in front of the firing squad. And they asked him, said, do you have any last, statements? And he said, yes, I have 3 requests. I would like for you to give all my possessions to my family. I would like not to be shot in the face, but instead to be shot in the heart, and I would like to receive a Christian burial. Santa Anna's answer, he took all the possessions from Fannin, divided them amongst the troops, shot him in the face, and had his body burned. If that doesn't tell you the brutality of what was going to happen to the Texans, I don't know what would. And again, folks, Goliath had as much to do with the galvanization of the Texas Patriots as did anything at this stage. So, the end of April 1836, Houston has basically sucked Santa Anna's army into a trap. Now, he has divided his army, Santa Anna has, so he doesn't have quite as many troops as he had against Goliath and the Alamo. He only has about 4,000 soldiers now instead of 8,000. And so Houston wasn't quite as outnumbered as he had been, but he was still considerably outnumbered. So he sucks him into this little trap up against the San Jacinto River. And the place he's chosen is a flat, marshy plain. It's surrounded by trees, water on 3 sides. And basically, he knew that there was only one way off the battlefield, and that was total victory by either him or Santa Anna. Houston waited until 4 o'clock in the afternoon to attack the army. That was not by accident. The Mexican army traditionally took a siesta at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That was a very typical thing. Everyone knew it happened. And sure enough, that afternoon, Houston had spies inside the camp, and they reported to him that the soldiers were indeed taking their siesta. So they were not prepared for an attack. And Houston's army opened up, and even though it was vastly outnumbered, they began the attack. And this is an old postcard from the San Jacinto Valley, and you can see the San Jacinto River in the back there. And this is a big monument to the San Jacinto battle. You can go there and still see this. It's right outside of Houston today. So, how did the battle end up? Well, basically, it was one of the most overwhelming victories in American history. It was just really, if we didn't actually have the figures to it, we would probably think that probably somebody was making it up, because it was so overwhelming in terms of the American victory. It only lasted 18 minutes. The Mexican army was caught so unawares that they took off running. They suffered over 600 killed, and over 650 were taken captive. Clearly, about a third of the Mexican army was either killed or captured in this 18 minutes. Houston's army, on the other hand, only suffered 2 deaths, 23 wounded, one of which was Houston himself. He actually led the frontal assault on the Mexican army. He had been kind of accused of being a coward during this time, because he refused to confront Santa Anna, but he took the leadership. He led the frontal assault. He was wounded himself, and just won an absolutely overwhelming victory against Santa Anna. Santa Anna, to his disgrace, tried to escape dressed as a common soldier, and we caught him. The Texans caught him. And even though there was a lot of pressure on Houston to execute him for what he had done at the Alamo and Goliath, Houston said, no, I will let him live as long as he agrees to an armistice and turn over Texas in writing to us. Santa Anna was the absolute dictator of Mexico at this time, and he had the power to do that. So Santa Anna, rather than escape or rather than give his life up, chose to sign over Texas to the Texans. And this basically is how Texas got its independence. Now, it's a painting of the Battle of San Jacinto. It's not much of a painting, but it's something. There's a legend about the battle. And I don't know if it's true or not. Nobody knows if it's true or not. We know that some elements of it are true. But I'm sure all of you at one time or the other heard the song, The Yellow Rose of Texas. Well, what most people don't realize is that what they're singing about is the Texas independence and the Battle of the San Jacinto. So here's how the legend of the Yellow Rose goes. Houston reportedly had an eye for the women. And Houston, understanding this, reportedly had sent a beautiful mixed race girl, part Mexican, part Black, into the camp. And she was supposedly told to kind of parade herself back and forth in front of Santa Anna to get his attention. And apparently it worked, because the story goes that Santa Anna, upon seeing her, asked his lieutenants to bring her to his tent, and that he was not to be disturbed during this siesta under any circumstances. It was during this period of time that the attack took place. And the story goes that for the first 10, 15 minutes of the attack, the lieutenants were scared to death to basically alert Santa Anna to the attack. And that's one reason they say that the victory was so overwhelming, was that Santa Anna was not in charge. Now, nobody knows if this is true or not. We know that there was indeed a young mixed race girl that was in the camp. There is pretty good evidence that Santa Anna did bring her to his tent. Whether or not Houston sent her in there as a lure, we have no idea. But we know this. It wasn't long before somebody penned a song, The Yellow Rose of Texas. And it is indeed about this young girl who basically, took Santa Anna captive in her own way and allowed the Texan army to defeat him. This is a statue of the Yellow Rose of Texas in Texas, and you can go there and you can see her, and she's a much honored woman. And like I said, nobody knows the total story about it. There's a lot of people that dispute it, but the Texans believe it. And I guess that's all that really matters. Okay, the fight for statehood. Now, after Houston defeats Santa Anna and Santa Anna hands over Texas to the Texans, immediately there was a movement began to bring Texas into the United States. That was the whole point of all this in the beginning. Everyone figured that as soon as Texas got its independence, if they did, they would become part of the United States. And so the Texans went about their business. They announced that they were now indeed an independent country, the Republic of Texas. They ratified a new constitution. They elected Houston as president in September. Slavery was legalized, and this was a problem. All the old 300 basically were slave owners. And these old 300 were definitely, they anticipated keeping slavery in the state of Texas. That proved to be a problem to its admittance. Texas was recognized as an independent republic by Andrew Jackson on his very last day in office. So the march towards statehood begins. Now, Texas is the only state in America that can claim that they were an independent country prior to being admitted into the Union. California would like to claim that. They said that they were the Bear Flag Republic for a short period of time, but that's definitely not how it went down. But Texas was indeed an independent country. They called themselves the Lone Star Republic for the next 10 years. And it took 10 years from 1836 to almost to the end of 1845 for Texas to become part of the United States of America. So what happened to these three people, Austin, Houston, and Santa Anna? Stephen Austin, of course, was the father of Texas. He's the one who had got he was the first impresario that got the land grant that brought the O300 there. He is considered to be the father of Texas. Unfortunately, he never really saw very much of Texas gain its independence. He died shortly after all this took place in 1836 at the age of 43. He was not a well man in the beginning, and all the strain of the dispute with Houston kind of put more of a strain on him than he could bear, and as a result, within a few months after Texas gained its independence, he dies. So Houston is kind of the man now. Houston goes on to serve the rest of his life as the leader of Texas. He served 2 terms as the president of Texas, its own country. Once Texas became a state, he was then selected to 3 terms as United States Senator, 18 years. And then he was elected governor in 1860, at the same time that Texas was preparing to secede from the Union during the Civil War. By the way, Sam Houston is the only man to ever be elected governor of 2 different states. He was the governor of Tennessee prior to his moving to Texas in the 1830s, and then he was the governor of Texas during the Civil War. He indeed died in 1863, still leading the state as the governor. So Sam Houston was, he was an absolute giant in Texas to the Texas people. Santa Anna, boy, he just kept hanging around. He remained a powerful force in Mexico, clear up to the battle the Mexican War, where he led Mexico in the Mexican War. He was finally defeated there. He was forced into exile to Cuba. He was brought back for a short period of time, and then he was exiled again, finally dying at the age of 82 in 1876. So Austin dies rather shortly. Houston and Santa Ana remain basically as leaders of their countries for the next several decades. This is one of the last photos of Sam Houston. This would have been taken probably when he was governor of Texas during the Civil War. So that's a picture of Houston. Now, Texas eventually did get statehood. They did become part of the United States, but it was a long process and it was highly drawn out and it was a very partisan affair. So we're going to see exactly here how they gained their statehood. The problem was slavery. Just like Missouri's admittance into the Union in 1821, it was a very complex problem for Texas. The United States was divided upon slavery, as we all know. The northern states primarily anti-slavery, the southern states primarily pro-slavery. And so when it came to Texas, the country remained divided on this. You had southern political leaders like John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, and he felt like that it absolutely was adamant that we get Texas into the Union as a slave state. On the other hand, you had people like John Quincy Adams, who the former president, the sixth president of the United States, who was now a leader in Congress, he was just as determined to block its admittance as long as they came in as a slave state. So it was a big partisan fight for the next 10 years about Texas, and it was all about slavery. It was all about whether or not it come in as a slave state or a free state. This is John C. Calhoun here, and this is John Quincy Adams. These are photographs of the two partisans. Pardon me while I get something to drink. My throat gets dry. I'm old. Okay, so complicating the whole thing was France and England. France, of course, had been basically a partner of the United States for the whole time, and they were very much desirous at this point for Texas to remain a republic. Why? Because France kind of had visions of kind of reconstructing its empire once again. And they kind of thought that maybe Texas as an independent republic would be a good ally to have. So they were kind of pushing for Texas not to be part of the United States, as was England. Remember, England had just tried in 1812 to come back and take the United States back over. And England had been repulsed again. And at the same time that all this is going on, America and England were having kind of a little diplomatic battle over the northern boundary between Canada and the United States, and particularly Oregon. So England was very much desirous of having Texas remain an independent republic. So France and England kind of got involved in this. They were kind of, negotiating with Texas to remain an independent country. And this really appealed to the European statesmen because it, like I said, it kind of provided a buffer state between Mexico and the United States and kind of took the attention off the United States' desires to move westward into Oregon. And plus it gave them a lot of raw resources, which they needed. So, this was the big deal going on in Europe as well. They were kind of involved in all this too. The problem with England was that they also were adamantly anti-slavery, and they really wanted Texas to ban slavery. So England was kind of messed up in their own right exactly what they wanted. So to kind of put all this in perspective, let's look at a map, okay? All this in white is the United States. We had gotten Florida earlier by cession, we basically purchased Florida from Spain. And so all this in white was the current United States in 1840. All this here, this unorganized territory, was the old Louisiana Purchase. That was also owned by the United States, but it was not territories or states. It was just basically unorganized territory. Up here, you have the Oregon country, and it was kind of occupied by both the United States and Britain. And this is where a dispute was ongoing between the U.S. and Britain, England, in the 1840s. Down here, you had the Republic of Texas. This is what we've been talking about. But they also claimed all this land. Mexico said, no, we never ceded that to you after you won the Battle of San Jacinto. But they also claimed all this territory here. And then, of course, Mexico had all this, which included part of New Mexico, Utah, Nevada, and of course, the big jewel and all was California. Now, the United States wanted all this. The United States wanted this. We've already talked about manifest destiny. It was the desire on the part of a lot of the leaders of the United States during this period of time to completely take all this over and make this the United States, which eventually we did. In fact, the most adamant of the manifest destiny people wanted us to take all of Canada and Mexico and Central America. It was their idea that we should take all of North America and all of that become part of the United States. Of course, that did not happen. And in all retrospect, it probably was a good thing it didn't happen for a lot of reasons. So, how did we finally end up getting Texas in as a state? Well, it's a really messed up deal. William Henry Harrison was elected president in 1840. William Henry Harrison was an older man. He was 68 years old, oldest president to be elected up to the time of Ronald Reagan being elected president. And of course, now Donald Trump, I think, was a little bit older than that. And of course, now Joe Biden is close to 80. But at that point in time, William Henry Harrison was quite a bit older than any other person that had ever been elected president of the United States. He took his inauguration in March of 1841 and caught pneumonia together with typhoid and died within a month. That meant that his vice president became president. Now, there was even a dispute about whether or not he was president or acting president, but we won't get into that. But Tyler was a Southerner, and Tyler was a very adamant pro-manifest destiny. He was also very adamant that he wanted Texas in as a state. The problem is John Tyler basically was an outlaw in both parties. The Democrats, he had always been a Democrat in the South, and once he ran with Harrison, who was a Whig, they disowned him. And once Harrison died and Tyler became president, the Whigs disowned him. He was a president without a political party. So he basically governed the next 3 years as a president with no power. And the result was that for another 3.5, almost 4 years, Texas languishes because John Tyler is unable to get Congress to come together to accept him. Finally, February 28th, 1845, both houses of Congress finally agree to allow Texas to come into the Union. It was kind of a compromise, mainly because they realized that John C. Calhoun wasn't going to run as, President John Tyler was not going to run as president again. And so rather, that was kind of part of the agreement that if he wouldn't run for president again, then they would annex Texas. Texas comes into the Union, and on his last day of office, it is finally admitted into the Union, becomes the 28th state, December 29th, 1845. This is a photograph of John Tyler. By the way, John Tyler is a really interesting president. Most of you probably never heard of John Tyler, but he is a really interesting man to to talk about and discuss. I'll just tell you briefly a couple of things about him. Number one, he had more children than any other president in American history. He had 15 children by two different wives. He also fathered one of those children when he was in his, I believe, 70s. One of those sons, in turn, also had a great number of children, and he also fathered children late in his life. To the result that, believe it or not, folks, we're talking about a man who was president in the 1840s. John Tyler still has a living grandson. His grandson is still living, one of his grandsons. His great grandson still has the family plantation in Virginia. It's open to the public and you can visit it. But John Tyler was a really, really unique person. And it's almost amazing to me that his grandson is still living, because we're talking close to 200 years ago. I mean, that's quite a feat, to say the least. The new president was James K. Polk. James K. Polk was as ardent a believer in manifest destiny as we have ever had. He was absolutely, more than any president we've ever had, someone who wanted to grow the republic in terms of land. And he becomes president of the United States at the same time that Texas becomes the state. Now, he wasn't satisfied with that. A lot of people believed in manifest destiny, said, okay, let's take a breather. We've got Texas in now. Polk said, no way. I want all of New Mexico. I want all of California. He also wanted all of Oregon. He got it all, folks. He said, I am going to grow this country. We are going to basically rule from coast to coast. So one of his first acts as president was to offer Mexico $5 million for basically California. And Mexico, of course, by this time, they were very upset because they had seen their old viceroyalty of Tejas gone to America as a state. And they said, no way, we're not selling you California. So Polk, to kind of put it succinctly, had a cause to grow the republic, but he needed a reason. And so he set out to basically provocate a war. Now, that's probably not politically correct to say, but if you read the history of the Mexican-American War, it was no doubt a provocation on our part. It would have never happened had we not wanted it to happen. We wanted it to happen, at least Polk did, and the Congress. Polk wanted California. He wanted New Mexico. He wanted all the disputed land around Texas. He wanted Oregon. And he says, if it takes a war to get it, then so be it. We'll have a war. And so he goes looking for a reason to have a war. And here's what he basically decided on. The Mexican government had never accepted the independence of Texas, even though Santa Anna had signed it over. They basically said it was under duress, and they knew they weren't going to get it back. But they said we never accepted it. They always said it's a rebellious province. They most certainly never accepted the southern boundary at the Rio Grande River. We claimed that the Rio Grande River, Texas and in the United States later said that the Rio Grande River was the southern border. And he said, no way. The land we signed over to you was the old dominion of Stephen Austin's, his old colony. We in no way granted the rest of Texas to you. So Polk decides he's going to send an American general by the name of Zachary Taylor down to the southern part of Texas along what's called the Nueces River. And he basically tells Taylor, I want you to patrol this strip of land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River. And although it's not said so in so many words, he basically said, go out there, reason to have a war. And sure enough, it happened. So March of 1846, Polk orders Taylor into the Nueces Strip and orders him to basically find a reason to have a war. Here is the Nuches Strip. This is the you can see here's Corpus Christi. Basically, Mexico said that this was the border of Texas. Texas said, no, the border of Texas is here, the Rio Grande River. And so this was all disputed land according to the United States. And this is where Zachary Taylor began patrolling with his army. He went down here and basically he said, this is part of Texas and we're patrolling it to keep it safe. The result was that we ended up having a war. Now, who was Zachary Taylor? Zachary Taylor also became president of the United States a little bit later, and he also died in office. He was only the second president to die of office. He died in office after about a year in office. He consumed too much ice milk and cucumbers on a summer day and got gastroenteritis, and the doctors tried to bleed him, and they bled him to death. Kind of ironic in a sense. But Zachary Taylor was 61 years old in 1846. He was an old veteran frontiersman and Indian fighter. He had a nickname called Old Rough and Ready. Old Rough and Ready would rather live in a tent and sleep with his soldiers than live in a house. In fact, he had a very strained relationship with his family because he very seldom was home. He didn't like being home. He wanted to be out on the frontier with his soldiers. He was a true soldier's soldier. The problem was he wasn't a very good soldier. He didn't have a lot of military training. He had grew up in the army, but he didn't know tactics and strategy very well. And even though his men loved him, he wasn't a real good general in terms of being able to figure out what maneuvers to make. Although he did pretty good in the beginning of the Mexican War. This is General Taylor. Later on becomes President of the United States after the Mexican-American War. April 25th, 1846. Taylor had a group of soldiers out patrolling the Nuches Strip when they are attacked by Mexican soldiers. It was a battalion of soldiers under a man by the name of Seth Thornton, and Thornton's troops, some of them were killed, 14 of them. This was reported back to James K. Polk in the Congress, and they immediately seized upon this Thornton affair, as it became known as, and asked Congress for an immediate declaration of war, which was passed on May 13th, 1846. So Polk got his wish. He said, I want a war, go find me a war. And Taylor found him a war. And as a result, we began the Mexican-American War in April of 1846. Not much happened right away. By the way, this is Seth Thornton. He later on serves as in the Confederate Army. He himself is not killed, just some of his soldiers were killed. The first battle of the Mexican-American War was the Battle of Palo Alto, which is a little town right near Brownsville, Texas. If you know where Brownsville is, it's right there at the very corner of Texas and Mexico on the Gulf of Mexico. It's right about as far south in Texas as you can get. Taylor met up with an army of Mexican soldiers, about 4,000. He only had about 2,200. And they engaged in a little battle at Palo Alto. And in the ensuing battle, which was primarily an artillery battle, Taylor absolutely routs the Mexican army. Mexican army didn't have a lot to fight for. They really didn't put a whole lot of battle until they were actually cornered in Mexico City, and then they battled pretty hard. But in the beginning, at least here, at the beginning of the Mexican-American War and in Palo Alto and some of the other battles, which we'll talk about next week, they pretty much just, turned tail and ran. So the Mexican War began in earnest. And this is a painting by a man by the name of Carl Neville, the Battle of Palo Alto. We have a lot of paintings by Carl Neville. He followed the soldiers around and made paintings of these battles, which you'll see several of them next week. So next week, we're going to talk about the Mexican-American War. It's one of those wars that's kind of forgotten in American history. We all know about the Civil War. We all know about the Revolutionary War. We all know about World War One and Two. Of course, of recent, most of us have lived long enough that we saw the Korean War and the Vietnam War, and of course now the War on Terror. But the Mexican American War is kind of one of those forgotten wars. We don't hear much about it anymore. Uh, but it's a very interesting war, and it has a lot of implications for the future of America, as we'll see. I always end up recommending a book and a movie. Uh, if you're interested in reading a book about the Lone Star Republic and the battle for Texas independence, there's a great book by H.W. Brands called Lone Star Nation. It's an excellent book. I read it. I highly recommend it. As far as movies, I'm kind of a huge fan of Sam Elliott. I'd watch Sam Elliott read the phone book. I mean, this guy is one of my favorite actors in America. And he made a movie some years back. It's actually kind of a mini series that was on TV called Gone to Texas. And it's a movie basically about the story of Sam Houston. He plays Sam Houston in the movie. And it's not a great movie, but like I said, I love anything with Sam Elliott in it. So if Sam Elliott's in it, I'm going to watch it. And I have watched it, and it was a very entertaining movie. So next week, the Mexican American War. And we'll find out exactly how we gained New Mexico and California, the rest of Texas, and basically extended our borders from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. So thank you for being with me today, and I'll see you next Monday.